Okay, I've started recording. And welcome everyone. This should have a certain epic nature to it. Your patience should be very possibly rewarded pretty strongly. This webinar, I have something that will be either a major piece, very possibly a major breakthrough for people, veterans of LOI and or fairly new people alike. It's not that it'll be exactly unfamiliar, but there's something I think about the way I can show something and present an idea that I'm pretty excited about. And it's really the central idea of LOI. And then I don't have a lot in the way of new slides. I have a bit. Let's do it. What happened was I was on the way to working on covering the idea of should, which is actually an epic idea in and of itself and has a tremendous amount of implications and benefits. The idea of what others should do in our minds, of what we should do, what we should be like, regarding our goals, what we should see, how soon we should see it with progress. There's this layer whenever that word and or the concept behind the word without the word, but it's there, you know, when we learn to notice it as it pops up, or if we're not aware of it, regardless, there's this layer of what amounts to morality that is so rampant and pervasive in our lives as we both go for achievement with goals and as we relate to ourselves and as we relate to others. And then, of course, as I've alluded to various times, our money is going to be very strongly, and the ease in which we make it and the amount that we make is going to be pretty strongly impacted in many cases, or perhaps all cases, by how we relate with others, right? And even if people like us and we relate well in a certain way, the way our relationship and understanding of this whole concept of should and how it creeps in implicitly and invisibly is a major deal, and it's a major poison in relationships, and the way people normally deal with stuff. And again, they have people somewhat ironically or oddly enough, morality is a massive part of people's lives and goal achievement, but they don't think of it as such, right? When people think of morality, I guess people might think of different things, but in the sort of Christian context, I tend to be pretty obsessed with things related to sex when it comes to morality. And then I don't know what the heck else, maybe climate change for, for people and various political ideas and so forth. But in reality, there's just so much, like, let's say people get into, and this is all just by way of introduction, but I'm not even getting to the main idea yet, but just giving you a sense of what I mean by covering the idea, this word should. The real secret to relationships is to be able to boil them down to really being able to see what's genuinely important to others and being able to see and then hone and pare down or discover some sort of paring down the wrong and discovering the good in terms of what should be, or what should in the right sense be important to us. The sort of logical meaning of the word should would be something should be if it is an idea that would lead to good, right? Like if it's somehow consistent with a premise, or it will, in other ways, lead to actual goodness, actual conscious experience of goodness. Ultimately, what should be in existence is one general thing, which is we should want all others, to have the best, possible net positive, value of experience, conscious value of experience, and then we and everyone else should actually have that, right? So we should want it, we should care about others having it, and then we and them should have it. That's fundamentally what should be in the world. Furthermore, there's no such thing as a necessary evil. There, as a practical matter, on Earth, there's plenty of choices where you're picking between two choices that aren't, you neither have perfect knowledge nor might it be obvious that anything's perfect. Especially this comes up when you're choosing people, right? People to work with, people to have a relationship with, people to be president, right? some people might say, oh, I'm sick of choosing between the lesser of two evils. Well, when you're dealing with people, then there's going to be flaws, right, and imperfections, and so and then there's plenty of other choices, right? Not all. It's not like everything has a trade-off, or you're always having to do that. But regardless, a necessary evil though would be something which is a contradiction, doesn't exist. There's no actual property rights violation or contradiction. Idea-wise, contradiction, in terms of negative morality, violating a person, there's never an instance where violating an innocent person is going to lead to good. And when I say that, I'm not going to get too much into this. I'm a little bit glossing over it. You can think about it for yourself and just apply it as it's logically true. If you find something clearly not wrong with it or whatever, you can just find a way to interpret what I'm saying where it's correct. Like what I mean, you're not violating a person's property if you tackle them to get them out of the way of a car, right? Does that make sense? So there's times when you would do what otherwise might be violating someone's property because again, they're going to get hit by a car and you're pushing them out of the way, right? But that's just not what I mean, by a violation. But I'm not trying to get too much of that. But but the real interesting key to getting the idea of should right is to eliminate a tremendous amount of poison that seeps into relationships, and that's going to seep into our mind in so many ways. Of all the various things that we should do, how fast we should see progress, whether we should measure up to this, that, or the other thing, all kinds of standards and norms seep into our mind that take on a moral component, right? Like, is it morally wrong to be stupid? Well, what is being stupid, right? It's not really a state of being. It's more like you kind of do something and you're like, well, that was stupid, right? Or someone else does something and you think, well, that was stupid, right? Then separately, there's ignorance where you're just not aware of something, right? And then some people, or not some people, in some instances, we might feel like, well, myself or some other person should have thought of that or should have been aware. But one way or the other, our minds are so quick to add a moral layer to that, right? That's we want to be able to question. We want there to be a space, like a mental space where we're able to think about whether or not we want there to be a moral component, whether it's helpful or whether it's detrimental. So there's that I wanted to cover. I still want to cover it. We'll see how far I get. Then I wanted to cover something that I started to talk about a bit on Instagram last year, and I talked about it in webinars last or the year before, and I'm sure before that. But the idea of luck and how important it is to have the right view of it and not to dismiss it. And one sort of main idea there is for starters, anything that we're not like fully aware of, we don't have full knowledge of, then there's an amount of luck involved in having the outcome that that we're going for, right, or whatever. Luck and this idea of should, they overlap to some degree, or they influence each other or whatever, or they logically relate to each other in some ways, because we'll often judge ourselves or others positively and negatively. Sometimes we'll judge ourselves positively. Sometimes we'll close off inquiry where we're curious about how we succeeded about something, and we could ask further questions about what we did right, because something will have happened partially by luck, but we'll attribute it to our cleverness or awesomeness or perseverance or focus, right, or whatever. As an overall kind of simple mental picture, we don't really want to have like a casino metaphor where it's like it's not like in life you want to keep on making like 60% bets, right? That there's some narrow circumstances where that can work, right? But what you want to do is more like look at least have the mental image and the mental picture and the kind of question, does this apply? Because it'll often apply. A lot of things in life amount to something like fishing, where you can think of a fishing rod or a net, or in either case, you can set up the conditions. Farming could work too. You can set up conditions to catch a fish, right, or catch several fish or whatever. And some of that may not be luck or might not be luck at all. But then in terms of what you actually catch on a particular day or even over a particular year or more, it can be luck. And you want to set things up accordingly. And furthermore, you want to judge yourself and your methods and other people accordingly. And sort of embrace the idea that there's a lot outside of our control, there's a lot of outside of other people's control. Anything that helps us be less judgmental is usually going to be a helpful thing, right? And by the way, when we have views like this that are fairly simple and profound and are less judgmental, it tends to have a ripple effect on the people around us, and they tend to be less judgmental towards us, and it's kind of a virtuous, cycle. So so luck was on my mind. This all relates to goals as well, and what we've been talking about with goals. I had the slides about contradictions last time, but also I mainly covered the slide. Where did I have it? Here. With the goalscape and mindscape and the ability of kind of sliding and the awareness to get beneath our goals, to think about how we're looking at our goals, and then how we're looking at that, and how we're looking at our being able to think about norms, beliefs, and wounds and so forth, standards that we have, right? And this all relates, right? The words I'm using, the concepts, they overlap, they relate with the concept of should that's so pervasive, the idea of luck, and so forth. So I wanted to tie a number of pieces together, continue to form a kind of complete paradigm and a whole that's profound and different and very effective and correct for the most part, right? I don't choose what's correct, right? This is discovered, not just like, I don't just put this together. If I was just going to put together a nice sounding structure and scheme, I'd do it differently, right? There's a pretty cool article I read that just kind of came up, in my Firefox from Pocket, and it was this guy talking about rocket science. Do I have this on show screen? Yeah, okay. So, well, I just paused. Whoops. No, it's good, right? Good. All right. But actually, let me just pause and I'll bring it up here. Pause showing my screen for a second. Bring this up. Okay. So he wrote this this book, and about how you don't have to be a rocket scientist to think like one. And there's some overlap in what he talked about, and pretty much all the little, like there's like an interview with him, so it's like he talks a little bit about his book to market it. But he said a couple things that, or basically each of the things he said overlaps with basically what I know to be correct. And so one of the things he says, he argues we should switch our default, and just using the word default when it comes to thinking shows that he's onto a very correct paradigm, right? Just people don't often think of the idea of default when it comes to their thinking. They just don't think in that word, in those terms. But just having the distinction of default thinking as a distinction in and of itself is huge, because then you can compare how you might think by default with how you might otherwise think, versus not having the concept at all, and then you just think of how you think is how you think, and you don't think of how you think in the first place, and so forth. So anyway, so really good start to say we should switch our default, in other words, our default thinking, he means, from, and then he says, from convincing others that we're right to convincing ourselves that we're wrong, right? And as a little bit of a bumper sticker type thing, that of course you can get more and more nuance, but he's making a nice pithy summary, which is in which case he can't be overly nuanced. So it's a pretty damn good little pithy summary, right? We should switch our default from convincing others that we're right to convincing ourselves that we're wrong. I read this to my wife. She said something kind of funny because she's like, yeah, we try to convince ourselves we're wrong, and that's how we find out that we're right, and then we can, And then I was like, oh yeah, and then we can, better convince other people that we're right. But in all seriousness, this is nice, right? And then trying to think why I brought this up. About thinking, defaulting, and then he said one other thing. The fail fast and fail often, he's not a big fan of, which is kind of cool. But maybe I just wanted to, bring up that main thing. So you can look it up if you want. I've probably shown you enough about the article that you can search for it. And if I think of something else, I'll refer back to it. Okay, I may have been in the middle of a little bit of a thread and lost it there, but either way, I know what my overall main thread is that I want to get to. So see, I was talking about a little bit about relationships, and I covered the should and the luck, the fishing, and in case I didn't tie that over, like if you just generally think of life and achieving stuff, and including when you're judging others, as fishing, right? Whether you catch a particularly awesome fish is in one sense outside of your control. Now, there's what you want to do is set up is discover the right questions and then discover the most you can about how to set up the conditions to catch the best you're going to, to catch the best, or to set up the conditions best to catch what would be best to catch. And then you catch what you catch. And of course, if you're able to pour more time and perhaps other resources into it, then you can, maximize your ability to catch within whatever time frame, and so forth. But even just that simple mental picture, I think, can go a pretty long way on how you should think about things. And it can also further shed light on impatience and a sense of rush, or a sense of how soon you're supposed to catch the right fish, so to speak, and so forth. And if someone else catches a bigger, better fish than you, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're better or there's something wrong with you. Oh, and I'd mentioned about stupid, and that might have been where I thought of the article as well, where we can get down on yourself. Maybe that was mixed in with should, but I guess that was relating to but it all relates, right? Like with the kind of moral layer that we put on things, and somehow not having thought of something that in retrospect we don't see how we couldn't have thought of it, or someone else doing that or us doing it, that we again tend to add like a moral layer to that. So, but then as I was working on showing my own ideas to be wrong, so to speak, breaking them down, I try to come up with a structure for webinars and good stuff and good examples. But then more sometimes that doesn't just happen on demand. My mind goes in other directions and so forth. But then I had a particular breakthrough that I'm excited about sharing with you that very much relates to all of this. So all right, so let's go straight to that. When we are going after something we want, going after a goal, if we go back to our overall slide here, perhaps. I don't know if this will be helpful or distracting, but I'll put it on for now. Let me see if it might just distract me. Let me just go back here. So if we're going after a goal, then what happens is we're trying to there's a number of related things. We're trying to see, one good way to put it is we are often doing what can be characterized as trying to see the path to our goal, right? We want to see, of course, that our goal is achieved. That's overall. That means, and we often would phrase it as we want to achieve our goal, right? We want the result. We want to hit a certain amount of money per month, certain amount of clients, a certain person to be in a relationship with of some sort as a client or customer or employer or relationship partner. In romantic relationships, certain number of followers on a social media, certain number of people on the webinar, right? Certain number of sales. Certain weight goal or fitness goal, or we might just feel like we should get out more. Of course, we gets that feeling for the last year perhaps, but it'll come back, right? So there's kind of these overlapping feelings that'll be very, very recognizable, I think, to all of us, right? Is again, we want to see that we've achieved our goal, but of course it's not that simple. We feel like we want to see a path toward a goal, or at least a path forward where we might make progress with it. We might try to look at things from different angles. So we might think how to look at the landscape or the planning. We might think of how to look at it. We might think of trying to find the right path. That's probably the most common thing that we're going to feel, right? Like a certain amount of goals will feel like taking a step back, and maybe I'm looking at this wrong, right? And so we'll try to look at it differently or from different angles. But again, it can be common to just try to find the path to our goal. So we want to find or see or perceive the path. We might not call it, we might not phrase it like I want to perceive a path, but achieving and perceiving get blurrily mixed together automatically, right? It's the same way that I talk about perceived value and actual value and unblurring those two things and how important it is. Same thing with importance regarding ourselves and other people, right? A big mistake people can make that's very, very similar, or maybe even the same thing rephrased as the value of perceived versus actual value, is thinking what's actually important. We can think of this in terms not just with potential customers, but with kids. You can imagine, even if you don't have kids, you can imagine being a parent, and to some degree, imagine being a parent, and there's certain things that are important for your child to do in your mind, right? And so you can imagine a parent feeling like, well, this is very important, my child does this, that, and the other thing. Now, what's important to you and what might overlap wonderfully with what's important in reality, but then there are things that are important to your child, right? And the same sort of thing can come up in a romantic relationship. Is there's things that might be important in a certain type of objective reality for your significant other to do or achieve or experience or whatever, but then there's things that they perceive as important. And it can be easy, particularly easy with parents, I would say, where they're so strongly see what's important in their sense of perception and or reality. Like they might happen to be right, but one way or the other, it's what they perceive to be important, that they don't really have the separate question and distinction of what's important to their child. Or sometimes it might be obvious what's important to their child, and that might feel necessary to pay attention to. But then that might be more of like a holiday thing, like on birthdays, right, or Christmas, where they pay a different sort of attention to what is important from their child's perspective. But then on a day in and day out basis, they might dismiss it a bunch. And the big problem with that has to do with at least rapport plus your child's actual happiness, right, and so forth. You're not pacing and leading, you ruin your ability to pace and lead. So instead, you have to kind of have this looming threat, in the background that the kids are trying to avoid by feeling that sense of cooperation with you, because they want to feel connected, to their caregiver. But if that's our main or only source of influence over our child, then that's when people have particular problems in teenage years and always, but especially then, because that'll fade. All right. So what I'm setting up here, I'm intentionally giving a bit of context and framework, because it's important that we feel what I'm talking about here. When we go about goal achievement, which is sort of all that we ever do, right? And I don't mean that dismissively. Like, it's just in a grand sense, everything going on with us, especially if we kind of blend our body and mind and then us as a being, and we just kind of take it as a package for a moment, right? Our kind of life on Earth, then sort of defined by wanting to make stuff happen, right? Achieve things, see results that we want, right? Otherwise, you just could stay still and stare at the wall. So every kind of action and thought is based on the presumption that you're trying to improve things, right? Which means find a path towards making something happen, having something, doing something, achieving a result. Which again, and I was saying how that overlaps with really perceiving a result, right? So, and if you think about it, as long as you perceive a result, then you feel kind of fully satisfied with that result being achieved. The only problem would be at some point perceiving that you didn't actually achieve the result, right? As long as you can keep perceiving that you've achieved a result, that would kind of, in a practical way, overlap with actually achieving it, right? I'm not suggesting that you fool yourself. I'm just saying, I want us to note that logically speaking, the perception of a result achieves the same thing as actual achievement. Like an illusion can give you the same feeling of achievement as something more fundamental or actual, until and unless that was something, the bubble was burst or whatever. So it's, no matter kind of who we are or what the circumstances, there's an overall paradigm that we end up being trapped in, right? At some point in my life, I developed a thought, sense, feeling kind of paradigm that there was some way I was trapped, like in terms of something to do with my mind, mentally, something, and there had to be something better. There had to be a way out of the trap. It was like being in a circular room with no doors, like kind of a smooth, surface, but feeling like there has to, like you're trapped and there's a way out. I thought of another illustration a couple of days ago, where it's like, if we can imagine being in a place where there's a bunch of rooms, right? You might imagine a sort of simulated virtual reality or a game or something like this. Not that it'd be a very fun game or not, but anyhow, where you're like in a room and you feel like cold and hungry. And so all you can really see to do is like, well, let's look at another room, right? And then you find something that looks like it might start to be able to alleviate one of those two things, being cold or hungry, right? Maybe a block of wood, right? Maybe it's like a survival game where your character just says that you're cold and hungry. You don't actually feel it as a player, but and you can see like a bar where your hunger, if it goes, if it reaches a zero, then you start to die or something like that. So you need to find a way to deal with that, right? And so you might find a block of wood, and then in another room you find a way to light the wood, and then you might find some things that you might cook on there and or make a shelter, right? And so you start to get this sense of progress because you started out cold and hungry. And you can get to the point where you feel like you're achieving something, but where it becomes sort of all there is, where being sort of comfortable and full feels like the whole point, and that you're winning and you're no longer trapped if you're comfortable and full. And then if we were to put other people in there and they had the same sense, then everyone was kind of accidentally reinforcing that. But everyone's actually trapped in this multi-room place, and they don't like, and in this paradigm, and they don't quite really realize it. Or they might come up with various stories and superstitions, or to explain the greater sense of it all and how it got made, but they don't really end up breaking them out. They kind of end up in the same treadmill, despite having a kind of story about how what's all going on. The part of the trouble was these stories. I started to see that the stories that were made up, or not inherently made up, but the stories that were available of, like, I've talked about this, like when I was 16, and I was lying in bed one night, and it was one of the major defining moments of my life. It was a major paradigm shift that started, because I noticed a major contradiction within the what Christians believed, right? And I knew what Christians believed genuinely, not as a caricature, because I was raised as one. Plenty of people that were one. I basically was one. I am one now. But there's major flaws in what actual Christians believe, not in what Jesus said, but in what actual Christians believe. And there are two things that are major parts of Christianity, and I noticed that they didn't go together. And one was that the point of life really comes down to whether you choose God or choose to reject God, right? Choose whether or not to reject God. And but then they had another belief, which is that you can't really know whether God exists, that there's a certain faith or gift of faith or faith that you have, which in their practical meaning that they had to mean by faith based on the implications of how they used it and other ways and so forth. It, again, not how Jesus used it, but in just how actual people reinforced and believed and clearly believed, right? We're just pervasive in how people thought and talked, and it showed up everywhere and in a cohesive way. Is that you don't know, and that's where faith comes in, right? And so, but I'm like, all right, so if there's God, and God, everything about the earth it's all about whether you choose to reject God or not. But you can't know one way or the other. I thought maybe there is a way to know, right? But in order for that to be the case, there would have to be a way to know in general, right? There'd have to be some method by which to know what's true, and then you'd have to use that method on the question of God's existence. And so, yeah, I said to God, when I say I said to God, I'm just saying, like, I said God such and such. I don't mean that God showed up and I had a conversation back and forth with God. But presuming that God could, hear me in the first place, right, being God, that I spoke in my mind. But I said, God, if there's a way to know that you exist, like it seems like it's very plausible that there's a way to know that you exist, and that it doesn't really make a lot of sense for life to be all about whether or not we choose to accept you or not, and yet there to be no way to know that you exist. There's certainly at least plausible that there's a way to know, and so if there is such a way, then seems like it'd be really good for people to know, like me and others, and so please, show me what that is. And it wasn't like I wanted proof in the sense of like, God, strike this, pen with lightning, right, or something like that. But so it wasn't like I was demanding proof. It was more like I realized that there might just be a way to know, which would change the whole equation massively, where now life would be about seeking understanding about what's good and important, and then fairly obviously one of those good and important things would be like, well, who's making everything all the time, and who, you know, might love us and that sort of thing. And then, you know, what's the purpose of it all and that sort of thing. So it was kind of one of the first main obvious questions, right, to address in the first place with, and so that was kind of started my journey. For some reason, I felt like that related, or that was a time to mention that. I've said it in the past, but not in this series, I don't think. And I've shared that moment. And I said it after talking about this idea of being trapped, right? Because it all relates to this idea of there's got to be a better way that exists that we're supposed to find, right? And so again, if we imagine that virtual reality, that just game, computer game, where it starts to feel like we're fine and we're achieving our purpose by just getting more comfortable, accumulating more of the stuff that we originally needed really badly to be comfortable, right? Like back to that game where we started out cold and hungry. Maybe we accumulate a whole bunch of cows and wheat and other foodstuffs in the game that we can plant and grow, and now we have oodles of it, and we're storing it up because it was once necessary, and it still is, but there's only really a certain amount. But then that just kind of feels like the purpose, and then we might try to find other things to distract us at some point or whatever. But maybe, you know, there's like a greater purpose, and then people do ask that, is there a greater purpose? They ask that a lot, but then they go about trying to see, we're back to this, try to see the path to it, or what it is. And the huge thing I have to share with you, the kind of epic thing I have to share with you now that can kind of explain the heart of Law of Implication, the heart of, not Law of Implication as a brand, but Law of Implication is referring to that which we need to discover in life, that's everything. Understand about understanding in order to understand what we need to understand, right, about the rest. What I want us to do is first, on the one hand, be able to fully feel how everything about questioning and finding the path, even finding purpose, goal achievement on a grand scale or a small scale, it all ends up coming down to us being trapped without really realizing it, where the type of question we're asking all actually has an invisible assumption that keeps us trapped. And that is, we're trying to see either a result or a way to a result, or a way of looking at an angle on, we might say, like, how do I see the path? How do I see? But what the other side, what the verses or is the way out, the massive change that if you do this consistently, at first it might feel somewhat obvious or not, but we need to watch for how we keep sliding back into the limited, trapped way of looking at things, seeing how seductive it is, and to get back to the right way. Instead, we want to ask, again, we want to realize, sorry to keep on pausing here before I get to the payoff, but, and I'll type this on a slide in a moment. But we want to be able to recognize each and every variation of the question, how do I see the path? Or how do I see how to see the path? That's all still trapped. What we want to do is be able to ask something like, with what do I see? And not even necessarily the path, okay? But how do I build? How do I understand? those are half of the sentence there. How do I, so again, but the basic idea is, with what do I see? Rather than even when people are asking, how do I see the path, or what, can I look at this from a different angle? Can I look at this in a different way? They're still assuming a basic fundamental idea of looking, utilizing what they're already given to look with. I came up with a couple of further illustrations. One is, suppose I were to put someone in a car and give them, and the idea is that they want to, or telling them to, and they somehow buy that or whatever. But the idea is that they have a car and they have a bunch of tools related to the car, maybe a GPS, and so forth, where they need to, they're in New York, they need to drive to wherever, but somewhere even possible to drive to. It could be. We could either pick that it's possible to drive there or not. But sorry, I'm stumbling over a pretty simple example here. Let me just do it better. So if I meant to cover this before I kind of explained or started to explain the whole idea, but regardless. So if someone's given a car and they need to get somewhere like LA, then at the point where they're thinking, all right, so how do I utilize this car and the other tools available to me? Maybe they have $200 and a map, right, or or whatever, and they need to get from New York to LA. They need to do it, in 3 days, right? In that mental picture, what I'm saying is that what people do is basically it illustrates how at some point people will stop looking deeper and use the perspective they have. Fundamentally, they might look around with that perspective. They might look at different angles given what they have. So they might look at different angles on how to use the 200, how to use the car, and so forth. But what I want us to be able to do, and let me interject another thing, which is each time you do this, and of course, in a certain way, especially if you're familiar with LOI, you're doing something like this. But this is going to explain it to the extent that I'll end up doing it justice in this webinar. There'll be something very poignant still about the way I'm explaining this and the distinction here. But each and every time you do this, you're going to accumulate a bunch of pieces and frames and so forth that'll make it faster the next time. So it's not like you need to ask a whole bunch of questions that are perhaps a bit odd or useless every time you have like kind of a small goal in life. If I seem to be implying that, I'm ultimately not at all. This is going to be sensible and very ultimately eminently sensible and practical. But what people do when you look for this is that there comes a point as people go back in perspectives that they stop realizing they're using a perspective or an assumption, and to them it's like rock bottom, or that's what you look with. And if they didn't look with that, they just have to feel like they're just giving up, and they would feel a combination of helplessness, utter confusion, frustration, a feeling of pointlessness, and like why are we bothering with this, boredom. Their mind would just go haywire on them, right? It may go haywire on you even listening to some of my webinars, right? But we want to get to where this is what so deeply makes sense and how to look at life. It's not about questioning everything or questioning assumptions, as I've mentioned in the past, because that amounts to the same thing as trying to look at something from different angles without realizing that you're not even in your body or mind. You see, like when you're trying to look at something even mentally from different angles, you're still stopping at certain perspectives and not realizing that those themselves are sort of arbitrary or absorbed from culture and other people and so forth, right? Assumptions. If we skip back over to the video game example of we start out cold and hungry, and then we start being able to make progress by going to different, like we start out in one room and then we go to different rooms, and there's things that we start accumulating what we need, and then we start getting wrapped up in that, and at some point we no longer question or we almost lose the ability to question certain deep assumptions and perspectives. And that's even more strongly we lose the ability if other people are there with us that have also lost the ability of reinforcing that norm and standard. And even further so, if there are these sort of cheap substitutes of questioning ultimate purpose and so forth with answers that are wrong in the sense of being woefully incomplete, containing critically false ideas, even if they also include correct ones, you know, and so forth. What was one other illustration that I was thinking? There was one with a car. I might think of it again, but so let's go to this slide and then I'll type in the other side. Okay. So we might ask how, in addition to asking what the heck I just said, which I'll put on a slide. If we were to ask how, I'll just read this and come back to it. But we build what I wrote here is we build the ability to see with. So a kind of critical phrase is seeing with. Each and every time you might feel like asking me, or of course asking yourself, or or just asking, why am I stuck? Why am I not achieving this the way I want? Or why am I feeling frustrated? Or why is even if you're asking why is my mind wandering on an LOI webinar, right? There's something you want, which is for it not to wander, and you're trying to see the path to it not, wandering, right? So come to notice all the different ways that we're asking, I can't see the path to this. How do I see it? How do I see how to achieve it? And then therefore, how do I see myself achieving it, right? And people can ask some version of, again, how do I look at it differently? But what we want to do is be asking, what can I see with? Now, those can theoretically overlap as synonyms, but I want to try to kind of tease them apart where we see two very distinct ideas. We build the ability to see with something better. So if you want to achieve something, then one of the first things is to be sure that what you think you want to achieve would actually be better, right? A lot of this overlaps with the idea of should again, right? A lot of what we're trying to accomplish has to do with a certain type of morality that we've absorbed, of that we should be like this, we should be like that. Again, our morality is tied to these standards and norms in a lot of cases, right? And also in terms of our own awesomeness. This all does tie together very strongly, and as you see it tie together, it can be very powerful. I mean, boy, is it, as you get the distinction I'm trying to give to you, that power is exponential. But true power isn't like the power to do magic, right? Because if we all had the power to do magic, then we would just be trying to do magic against each other in a sense, right? If I could, through the law of magical attraction, through some law of magical attraction or creation or whatever, if I could just make reality the way I wanted to through some kind of pseudo magical process, then other enlightened people could be doing the same thing, and then every time they contradicted, then what? We just kind of have to use our magical power against each other and try to force reality to conform to our goals that we are determined to have, right? So there's a massive amount of new and great power that's exponentially more than you might be used to. And I say might, unless you've kind of arrived at this very idea that I'm covering in this webinar, and the integration that I have between the should, the luck, what we've been talking about with goals, what's on this slide here. As you integrate this and get this fundamental distinction, and then the stuff that goes with it, the power is unrecognizably more and exponential in life. But true power is to lead, cause goodness, more goodness for yourself and other people, and as a ripple effect, and as an effect rippling back to you, out to others, back to you. To the extent that I've somewhat imperfectly, of course, applied this, but there's still a tremendous ripple effect of goodness in terms of actual quality of life and peace of mind and really goodness in my sphere, right, of people around me and reflecting it back to me, right, and so forth. And that's what real power is, right, is the power to create there's a nuanced difference between you creating and God creating, but you have power, right? Or else you'd have no power, no ability to love. Like everything would be literally pointless if you had no power. So, and therefore using the word create or cause is appropriate with respect to that power. So and I don't want to get too much of that, but it kind of, I think it's fairly simple on the surface, and that's all we need for this. So again, true power is the ability to cause goodness for yourself and other people. It's not, our power ends up being indirect. So you don't like directly manifest goodness. What you do is you use your power that as you use it indirectly, but reliably and predictably, easily, effortlessly in a certain sense, leads to goodness, and a ton of it. There's still luck, right? Someone could get cancer and suffer and die. Okay, not to be morbid, but but because I'm not claiming that you become, or that you are, you can't, you're either omniscient or you're not, right? And you're not. So there's a limit, but the amount you have is static. But as you understand this, then the actual use of your power, the practical ripple effect is exponentially more, what is it? Like kinetic, energy, right? Like instead of potential, right? You have a certain amount of potential power, but then the actual power, because actual power only is the power to do actual good, to cause actual goodness in conscious experience, right? But again, not like you manifest it directly. It's a ripple effect. And so this slide sheds more light, at least as you understand it. It's a little bit of a long sentence that, with some abstract ideas, but I'm referring to reality here. If I could invent reality, I could make it simpler. Of course, there'd be a lot of problems, right? I'm not saying God screwed up, but I'm having to talk about how things really work, and it's unfamiliar at first, perhaps, and so I beg your pardon on the extent to which it's abstract or difficult. So we build the ability to see with something better. All right. So as you use your power, you will, which relates to as I continue the sentence, but what can happen is you use your power when you seek to see with something better, rather than to see, when you try to see how to achieve your goal as the first step. Of course, that can be a ripple effect of seeing, as you see with something better, then of course you will see the path to your goal better, you see? And or you will see that the goal and or that first of all, you'll see that some paths aren't necessarily right, where you couldn't see that before. And you may see that the goal itself, which ultimately is a path, right? Like what we think of as goals are, in another way of looking at it, really just paths to experiencing goodness for ourselves and others, right? So paths like iterate, goals and paths sort of iterate, right? Like making a certain amount of money can be in a certain month or whatever, or getting a client can be seen as a goal legitimately, and it can be seen as a path to something else legitimately as well. So you see, so you will see paths more clearly, meaning you will see paths that previously were invisible. You will see paths that look good that actually now don't look good because they weren't so good. I'm being a little bit simplistic with my use of the word good there, but again, that you have to be simplistic with some things in order to explain others. Otherwise, I interrupt myself too many times. I already interrupt myself like mad, right? So if I'd do it even more if I did it even more. Right. So you'll see that some paths, but that's the same as seeing that some goals are not good bets, likely to lead to good, or that they're inherently wrong. They're inherently not going to. Something that greatly simplifies business is realizing, to go for a win-win-win, right? Not just a win-win, but a win-win-win. And a win-win-win is where in business, right, just to simplify it in a useful way, you're basically having one entity trade with another, right? It could be one person, it could be one group of people that form like a little partnership or business, but you're basically having two people or people-like entities trade, right? Something, right? Typically, one's giving money, one's giving a product or service, but whatever. It's a win-win if both parties are basically not deceived and are choosing, right? Get more at least perceived value, right? They're able with their free will to choose. And I guess we could say, but by me saying see clearly, then that kind of implies the idea that the actual value to them is also going to overlap enough with the perceived value, and they're all going to be better off, right? Or at least that it's reasonable. It's a reasonable guess that they're going to be better off. As long as it's reasonable that they'll be better off, that's perfectly legitimate. For example, if you buy a hamburger, but then you get hit by a bus as you're about to eat the hamburger, then that's an example of it. You weren't actually better off for buying the hamburger, but it was completely reasonable to suppose that you're better off for buying the hamburger, right? If you're hungry and it wasn't gonna, it was gonna overall have a positive impact on your valued experience, one way or the other. And if the amount of money you paid for it, was gonna have, be reasonable to pay for that valued experience. A win-win-win is then that the world at large is better off, not in the sense of like, some cause that actually is BS, right, or something like that, but in the sense of, not in the sense of necessarily like some civic duty, right, or whatever, but where sorry, there's so many examples that my mind's getting a bottleneck, like a traffic bottleneck. But of course, if you have an SEO client and you do a good job for them and they pay you money that you're happy to prefer to get versus the work that you're doing and all that stuff, then if then they go out and are able to provide their service for people and that's nice, right, then the world's better off, right? And then money is continuing to be created, right? Business is created, the economy grows and all that stuff, right? You don't need to be like saving the dolphins, right, in order for it to be a win-win-win. It just needs to be kind of something where it's not to the detriment of everyone else in some, pretty clear way, or a way that, could be clear if you thought about it. One other example that's come up for me is an example of what to avoid is whenever I'm dealing with an idea for an information product, which could be online, live, or some other way, and the person who's thinking of the idea for the information product or kind of pitching me on it in some way is talking to me about how it'll be like good content. I had a conversation at one point with somebody where, and they were like a good person. They were just kind of meandering into, again, being simplistic when I say good person, but someone that wanted to do business in a positive way and was well open to doing so and kind of being directed differently, as opposed to others that aren't, that don't care. But they were talking about a potential product and talking about how this person could provide great content for it and this could be great content. And I said, imagine, I said some other things, but I said, have you seen the 1980 movie, or at least based on what happened in 1980 movie Miracle with who the heck was it now? Kevin, who's in Miracle? Anyway, it was about the U.S. hockey team. And I could picture the actor, and I knew the actor's name at the time, but now it's slipping out of my head. Oops. Kurt Russell, yes. So, so the movie Miracle was about the U.S. hockey team practicing and beating the Russians. And I said, can you imagine Kurt Russell? And it was, a lot about him coaching them. And then they ended up winning, and it was a huge deal in 1980 for the U.S. to beat the Soviets, like for the culture and so forth, and what was going on at the time. It was a pretty triumphant movie. Actually making America in total context, the movie, pretty triumphant. But anyway, you can, and it was one of those great coaching movies. And so I said, imagine him doing coaching and him being like, yeah, like after a particular coaching session where he moved the players in such a way or got them to practice in such a way that was critical for them to get the result that they were trying to get, and him being, that was great content. Or, he gives an important speech, at halftime or something, and that was great content. No, right? Like when you're coaching someone, you're coaching them to get a result. So if you're talking to me about a product, then if it's not framed from the creator of the product and or the way it's going to come together in terms of, here is why we're going to really set the people, the coachees, right, the members, the attendees, whatever, up for success. And if it's not all about not just pitching me that the members will be successful, but a clear path, right, about why this is going to uniquely set them up, or maybe not unique, probably uniquely is a good thing, but whether or not it's unique, whether it's going to very valuably set them up for success in a very clear way, right? Then that's what Kurt Russell did in the movie. That's what an information product is all about, or should be all about, and that's fundamentally how I look at it, right? So that's a small example of, that's a lens that I came up with in essence through even deeper paradigms, right, or deeper lenses, that I use that to see with. But I didn't start out with it invisibly programmed into my mind necessarily, right? It had to get developed as something to see with. So if someone wants to make effective info products, then what they could do, and what's almost never happens, but what they could do, again, if they ask this fundamental question of LOI, is what do I see with regarding a coaching program or an info product, right? And then now I'm telling a good part of the answer, but you see with this idea of, and part of my example also was you if you are seeing with something that's causing you to say stuff like it's going to be great content, then you're seeing with something that's basically wrong, right? So, right, like, so you want to see with this idea of how are we setting people up for success? Like your coaching needs to be like, what is it, like a coach, right? A coach doesn't provide great content to his members of his team, right? He gets them to get ready to achieve a result, right? It's different. Can you imagine? It's kind of a funny picture, right? Kurt Russell and like that was great content already, or Braveheart, like with his speech about fireballs coming out of his arse and so forth, and right about like turning to his lieutenant and being like, wasn't that great content? uh, so uh, so I just don't think that way, right? And I know not to. Yeah. So all right. So I'm still on the sentence here. And then again, I'm going to type out the kind of central idea of this webinar in a bit. So we build the ability to see with something better. Right now, at least that phrase "see with something better" is a bit less abstract. Right? When in the case of an information product, you're seeing with something better. If you're seeing with the idea that you're like, it's analogous to being a sports coach or whatever, where it's about getting a result for someone, and the method, right, and your praise for your product needs to be directly about here's how and why they're going to have a massive advantage or the ability or a clear path to getting the result from my coaching. Okay, so right, and conversely, if a person is trying to see how to make a great information product, but what they're seeing with, they're not asking what to see it with, what they're seeing with without realizing it is this idea of having a bunch of great content, and they're seeing the path, and the result is like people buying it and leaving good feedback and praising it, or just making a lot of sales and not having too many refunds, whatever it is, right? But if what they're seeing with it has the possibility of statements like, yeah, that was great content, then no matter what angle they look, no matter how hard they think about it, no matter how hard they work, no matter how much they swear that they're going to over deliver and under promise, it's not going to probably matter, right? It's going to be subpar, or might be par, right, given what else is out there, but it's not going to be what's going to be truly effective. So we build the ability to see with something better by what happens is we don't actually do that directly. We can certainly ask the question directly, how do I see with something better? But then as you try to go about answering that, what you're going to do is you're going to cause a new space to form, and you're going to do that indirectly. The new space is going to form. Spaces form around things like questions, but questions come, and I wrote it into a new space allows part of a framework to appear. So we also, as we ask, how do we see with something better? We stop concluding things like, oh, I'm just not, I'm just not smart enough to understand this concept or this subject. Right? That's a very common thing people do. I don't mean like in OMG or something like that, or in business, but very commonly people will just kind of dismiss stuff by saying, oh, that's for smart people, right? They secretly believe they're smart, in their own ways, and whatever. But people say, oh, that's for smart people. I'm not smart enough to understand that, right? You're smart enough to understand whatever, as I said before, if you have the framework. It's just a matter of framework, not a matter of some weird mystical idea of being smart or not. There's not particularly such thing as being smart or not, especially in a generalized way. And it's just like a very unuseful concept. To whatever degree it's true, it's way more unuseful than it's useful as it's often used. This overarching concept of like being magically smart in general or not. Your your practical smarts regarding achieving a particular goal, learning a particular thing, figuring a particular thing out, large or small, has to do with what you're seeing with, and what you're seeing with is not fixed. It's not something you're magically have or don't. You can go about life with a fundamental paradigm of you achieve goals, you see paths, and you see paths that are wrong. You cross off wrong paths more efficiently, including sometimes that means a goal, right? Paths and goals, they end up iterating and being one and the other, the same thing. When you look at life as building what you see with, it just transforms. Everything else falls into place. And it makes even more sense and more intuitively about, it makes it feel more intuitive that you, what I said about things being easy and inevitable when you let go of fast, right? Fast ends up being, you're of course not building something to see with. That's basically what I ultimately mean, or my proof, or how I just know that this idea of trying to get something fast, right? It's just a kind of simple, oversimplified, but sometimes oversimplifying is useful, right? When I talked about fast, was it on this set of slides somewhere? Yeah. It might have just been this, might have been my main slide on that. Okay, yeah, right. Remember, easy, certain, pleasant versus fast, uncertain, unpleasant. So my big distinction, the big epic distinction today, is in a one way of putting it, the less simplified version, right? The more explicit, deeper version of, or explanation and proof of, easy, certain, pleasant versus fast, uncertain, unpleasant, right? But it looks like easy versus fast, but it doesn't look like easy versus fast. It looks like, it doesn't look like there's any choice except for fast or slow. You're either awesome or not. You know, every goal is kind of about proving how awesome you are, because again, people don't really want to believe in luck in this weird way, right? When you don't think that you have the option, without realizing it, when you take for granted that that's fundamentally what you're seeing with by default is your only choice, then you just have to keep wanting to believe that it's right and strong and awesome, right? And what do you see with, right? Yourself, your mind, your body, your core beliefs, right? Your eyes, yourself. So people so badly want to believe that their self is awesome. Socially, we learn to be kind of socially self-depreciating, outwardly. But why does it contain like a moral component if we call ourselves or someone else stupid, right? Someone walks up to you and says you're stupid, that feels moral and it is, right? It's a moral indictment in the meaning of our communication, right? It's like immoral not to be awesome, right? It's kind of weird how it all is. But if we dissect it and look at what it must mean, right? They're basically saying you're stupid in an immoral way, and that you're stupid and that's immoral, right? Interesting. So, and it comes then from refusing to rubber stamp that we know something we don't. So the various questions that are hanging out there that you guys have for me, in one sense, the answer to all of them is you're driving out of San Francisco on this distinction. Like you're trapped in a paradigm, could be only in certain areas of your life or temporarily, right? I'm not saying always. Like a lot of you have glimpses or strong understanding even of the basic distinction of law of implication. But for all of us, it's just so seductive and easy to pop out of it. But all the various forms of questions are like, well, I feel like I should be seeing the path. What am I not seeing? And I should be achieving this faster. Why am I not? Right? Or feedback, like I appreciate webinars where I get a feeling like I see more faster, right? If you just channel everything in a sense into, it won't really interrupt any of your current endeavors in life, right? It'll only speed you up constantly, but then you'll start to build more, and the paradigm will make so much sense out of what I'm doing with you. Is you reframe all of your everything into what do I see with regarding this goal? Not even how to achieve the goal, because remember, goals and paths to goals boil down to the same thing. And so you're just like currently seeing that a path seems to be one that's going to progress you. And then, or a result, right? And so you want it, and you want to see the path to it. But just then reframe that into, well, what do I see with regarding this thing that I think I want? How do I better understand what to see with? So let me write that down. So this is the the good part of the verses. The kind of wrong question is like, how is anything that can be kind of logically reframed as, how do I how do I see the path to what I want? Like, it's possible to, whatever I write on this first thing, it's possible to find a potential meaning of the words that like if I say, how do I see the path better, then a certain meaning of seeing the path better can be logically equivalent to, like, obviously if you see with something better, then you see it better, right? But how do I see the path to what I want is still a pretty good characterization, right? Let me see what else I wrote here. Right, like any form of how do I see progress? How do I, like, if someone says, well, how do I make progress? It ends up being logically similar to, how do I see progress, right? How do I perceive progress, or how do I perceive how to make progress? Those still all boil down to the same paradigm. And the answers are all the typical answers. So let's try to delve a little bit more into seeing the default, even though we live and experience it pretty regularly. But so I'm trying to make a certain amount of money, right? And I'm like, all right, well, how do I do this, right? What are some ideas? What are some actions I can take? What are some instructions? if someone feels like, all right, what's some advice that would be good? How do I feel more motivated, right? This is where we get into motivation, perseverance. Maybe I need to be more focused, more dedicated. Maybe I need to be more clever, more smart, that sort of thing. And now if someone achieves something, then the mind goes and wants to use that as evidence why you're more awesome, right? That's where luck, the understanding of luck is useful, right? We want to ascribe, we want to, I wrote a kind of a useful way here. Instead of, okay, so I've said this in various ways, but instead of, I'll just take the same slide here, regarding luck and you being awesome and such. I could say achievement, luck, achievement. Then, so we're not all powerful, right? And so, and again, people are trapped and they have a sense of it. And that sense of helplessness that I talked about in the first alchemy webinar, where our first experience of life is being helpless, basically, right? And then our mind creates a defense against that, and then it creates a defense to protect us from seeing that we have a defense against it. And so we're trying to feel non-helpless in life, right? And again, we can even see it in this computer game, survival computer game, right? Where we're cold and hungry and we want to feel not helpless. So we in the game search around and get to figure out what's going on and accumulate ways to accumulate food and shelter and other resources. So we feel less and less helpless. But so when we achieve a result that we want, since we don't want to feel helpless, and since there's luck involved, we basically attribute there's like what's the X factor in how we succeeded, right? Is you being awesome, and instead we want the X factor. And why does it have to be an X factor? Well, because we're not all-knowing and all-powerful, and so we really didn't know whether we would achieve a particular result, right? Anything outside of something very mundane, right? Any sort of thing that you'd be a little bit proud of. Why would you be kind of proud of a result in the first place? Was because it wasn't really guaranteed, right? And so you didn't really have certainty of whether you'd achieved it, and then you achieve it. So there's uncertainty and you achieve it. So there must be some X factor in some sense, right? Because you achieved something that was uncertain. So why would that be? Why did it fall? Why did the cards fall, so to speak, the domino fall in the towards it happening rather than it not? And then if your mind attributes it to you being awesome, then that seems to build up your confidence. You project maybe more confidence to others, or maybe more arrogance, right? It all can kind of go various ways. But secretly, right, your mind basically assigns it the X factor to something about you, your cleverness, perseverance, motivation, dedication, effort, right, things like that. Instead, if you make the X factor as method, right, then is what is correct. And I talked about this before in lots of ways, right, where it's like self-esteem or your identity and so forth coming from method, then you're at a solid place. And so if you're a fisherman and you catch a great fish, instead of attributing it to like, oh, it's the hat that I wore, or it's my cleverness and how I did this and that, if you attribute it to method, then that's only going to help you in every way, because if you understand that the preparation that you did to maximize your ability to catch a good fish still relied on luck that particular day to catch a good fish, and if you come up with even better preparations and context, then you won't necessarily catch a better fish. You might catch a worse fish, right? If someone's observing life and thinking about life in the normal way, then if they try to make better preparations, and they do, and they catch a worse fish, they'll think that they didn't make better preparations. But if you go by method, there might be ways that you know you made better preparations, and you just didn't catch a better fish because things fluctuate, right? You're just fishing in a sea, and you could try to fish in a better area, you could try to have a better pole, you can try to do all sorts of things, right? You can spend more time and catch more fish from that area with the same pole, and obviously that'll give you more chances to have a better fish, right? But in a practical way, this came up a lot in business with me, where I didn't base my idea of whether things were a good idea just on how much money we made that month, right? And that was critically important, right? I looked for different ways to understand what was being done right and what was being done wrong, and what were good ideas and what were good resources and good people to work with and all that stuff, right? So, and where did that come from is asking the question of, how do I see with something better, right? I originally was totally clueless when it came to business. My paradigm about relationships and importance, and not just projecting my own sense of what's important, and even what would really help someone is not the same thing as what feels important to them, right? Perceived value, actual value, perceived importance, actual importance. Those are both critically important to a relationship. If you only do things for a relationship partner or a business partner that actually help them, then that's terrible. Your relationship will probably fall apart, or it could be catastrophic in business at times, right? You just need to do things that they feel are important, regardless of whether it's even could be detrimental. Now, you might that can get into tricky questions, right? But the reason you might need to understand that is if there's things that are critically important to a partner that are detrimental to themselves, you might refuse to do them, but and that might be the right choice, right? Doing things that'll actually hurt somebody else might be a bad idea, of course. But then you're basically choosing not to have the relationship work, and that might be the choice you have to make. But to try to have it both ways is not a good idea. If you're going to be in a relationship with someone, you just need to do what's particularly important in their perception. And you can't like choose to be in a relationship with someone and choose not to do what's important to the person. You kind of have to realize you choose one or the other. Otherwise, you're just kind of fooling yourself, or delaying the inevitable, or just setting off a ticking time bomb for yourself and them and so forth. And people that might rely on your partnership and such. Kids, right? All right. So I kind of cluttered up the slide here a little bit. I can even just put this on another slide in retrospect. All right, great. All right, so let's make this bigger. Bang. Put a couple spaces. Ooh, didn't work out very well. All right. Beautiful, huh? All right. I don't have any question marks here, but how do I see the path to what I want? Some version of this, all right? And learn to kind of identify all the different logical iterations or manifestations of this type of question. So it's the kind of basic goal achieving, seeking question, right? Some form of this. And then how do I better understand what to see with? And then we can see how someone could get quickly impatient or feel like it's no progress being made if they're trapped in the default paradigm of how do I see the path to what I want, and instead someone is trying to guide them, or if they try to sit there and guide their brain, if their brain's stuck in this paradigm and they're trying to ask, well, how do I better understand what to see with, right? Then the first thing brain's going to try to do is just twist this back into this, because that's all it knows, right? And this is not the real, but it's a major issue, right? is to work at, and I can, try to make a webinar delving into this, even more, and kind of continuing to kind of resolve all these things together, but integrate kind of like discussion, practice, and integration of everything we're talking about with the luck, the should, the previous stuff, the mindscape, and so forth. And then this fundamental idea is your mind is going to try to turn it back into like dried milk, like I talk about with consciousness, where for your mind to process consciousness, it needs to take the consciousness out of consciousness. Right? It needs to find some way to represent consciousness without the actual consciousness, since your mind is not conscious. But this is very doable. But you need to be vigilant. You need to use your power, your free will, to basically channel it into understanding this distinction. And this is for all the marbles, right? How do I better understand what to see with? And then again, you may see that the goal itself is not quite what you're looking, because the goal and a path are about the same thing. So you want to see paths relevant to what seems like your goal. You want to, right? And this is, now you can see further how I just figured out and understood and discovered the whole framework idea of you achieve things by letting a framework build, or you're working in the greater context and greater frames. And what you see with is actually a succession of frames. Oh, I know. My other illustration of this had to do with, suppose that you're given a house where there's the foundation, where the basement and foundation is built, and it's in a plot of land. And you're not given a house, you're given a plot of land, and a foundation is built for you. And then you get to build your dream house. And you're given a nice budget of $500,000 with which to build your dream house. And so then there's all sorts of questions that people might ask. There's all sorts of manifestations of the typical success methods that people might use. They might draw up a blueprint, do good planning, look at all kinds of alternatives, look at different angles on what a house might be like and what they could put there. But if they never stopped and thought about both the foundation of the house itself and even the location of the house itself, right? Because they took for granted they were given a plot of land, didn't question that, didn't question the foundation, and then just went into the building of the house, what materials to build the house with, right? They got to ask all sorts of useful questions that kept their mind busy and got them feeling all sorts of achievement. They might have been happy with the outcome, in a sense. But if they had stopped to think, how do I better understand what to see with, right? Then they could have started from scratch and thought about what would really make them happy. And maybe it wouldn't be a house at all, right? Or maybe it would be in a different location, maybe have a different foundation, et cetera, et cetera. So one way or the other in life, you're starting with this, and this is where we can go back to this slide here that was so critical last time, right? You're starting with kind of this invisible mindscape, right? This is analogous in my examples to like the car that you were given to travel somewhere, or the in the game where the standards and norms and wounds have to do with being cold and hungry and then trying to get your character comfortable and to thrive. That's programmed in, so to speak, invisibly. In life, you absorb this from people around you, from a sense of everyone not wanting to feel helpless, while at the same time they don't know how to know what's true. They don't really know why they're trapped here and what's going on, and why they're trapped in their own mind, where they're kind of a prisoner of their own mind, right? Part of me realizing I was trapped at some point, not when I was 16, but like more like in my 20s, I framed it in a certain way where I came to realize that what I was afraid of when I was afraid of stuff, like if I was afraid of like I didn't make that much money and I was teaching a course on speed learning, right, on campus at UVA, when I would get the room for free from the registrar, sponsored by a professor, and I would post flyers. But if any of that didn't work in a particular year, I didn't really have a way to make money, right? So that's kind of scary. And I didn't really have any marketable skills or resume. I had a degree from UVA, but that was whatever, like that's nice when you graduate, but not nice, years later or whatever. Maybe it is, but it's very limited at some point. And I just didn't even know how to use it. I didn't know how to look for a job. Didn't have prior job experience, didn't really have a temperament or necessarily for having a job. So I realized that we were trapped. Oh, I realized that when I looked at what I was afraid of, that I was afraid of how my own mind would make me feel. If I had to do things, like what does it mean if I had to do stuff I didn't like to like make money, or I would feel in a way I didn't like because I didn't have money, right? My own mind was going to make me feel uncomfortable or disgusted or like kind of like doing things that made me feel inferior, or begging people to buy something, or whatever, right? So I was really like scared of my own mind, like, and kind of terrified of my own mind in a sense of, not that I felt terror in the moment, but where did it lead? Like if it got worse and worse, it would become terror, right? Like it's kind of like kids that aren't really yelled at, but they know that if they keep pushing it, they'll get yelled at or punished severely, right? And they're scared of that. It isn't really happening. They're not like terrified of their parents on the surface, but ultimately it comes down to that, in a certain sense, right? It's like if we follow how it would work, we're kind of terrified of our own minds. And that was what I mean by the trap that I really wanted to break out of. I didn't want to be terrified of my own mind. And normally the way that people are not terrified of their own minds is they just don't realize it, and they just again have that defense against the defense of realizing it, and it's just about like trying to prove that they're awesome, but it's all a house of cards. And that's where the idea of people lead lives of quiet desperation comes from. And we're sort of like keeping ourselves busy from feeling afraid of our own, how we'll feel about how to do various things, or what happens if we're alone, or it could be loneliness, it could be making money in various ways, or not knowing how to make money. And so that was what I felt about this. Like, look, it's like I'm in a circular room with no exits, trapped. There's got to be a way out. Like, this can't be the height of understanding, is to just be afraid of your own mind and just trying to outrace that, right? By accumulating enough stuff and relationships and backup plans that you won't actually have to do a lot of the stuff that you're afraid of, right? Or you just kind of keep outrunning and avoiding it. That didn't seem like a great final answer to me. But like everything I had to see with would just show me that, right? So I needed to, in a sense, ask the question, but that wasn't phrased in that cool way that I realized yesterday or whatever. Like, or, I mean, in a sense, I've said this before in one sense, but there's still, I feel like there's something new and unique about this. I gotta be able to build something different to see with, which will then allow me to see something else, like to see things somehow really differently, because I don't see any way out. So I need something different in order to see a way out, right? Like there's nowhere I can look with how I'm currently seeing. Like that has something to do with my strength, is that I seem to be pretty efficient or effective at like seeing when there's just no way with a certain resources or a certain something or other, certain starting point or set of parameters or set of premises, and there's no way out. I can't like fool myself very easily and into thinking that there's a way with a set of premises to get to a conclusion, of like happiness, in this case, or lack of like fundamental fear in life about my own mind, with the tools that I had, right? There had to be something else. And I couldn't see that something else in the usual way, because the usual way involves using myself, my perspective, my core beliefs, right? Like if you can't use the invisible mindscape to see what to see with, because what you need to see with are foundations and ultimate frames. What are those ultimate frames, right? The question of who you really are. This is where the answer that eluded me for a long time of like, I kind of approximated enough that I can get to something useful, but it was way better when I really figured it out, which is what existence is basically composed of. Because what are your fundamental frames? I mean, they've got to be like, well, who am I, right? And then who am I? And then there's obviously a world you're interacting with. And so what's the world basically made up with? And, you know, what's making it? Why? How? Right? I mean, it's not, I don't know. At some point, those fundamental questions are the fundamental questions. And so the ultimate frames have to do with that. And until, and what I would do is realize that the materialistic view of like there's like this self-existent universe that's made up of atoms that are kind of fundamental to reality, that breaks down. It doesn't it has fundamental flaws that can't be how things actually work. I can't be made up of determined molecules that are determined, right? Like in my mind, if my mind's made up of atoms that are behaving according to natural laws, then I have no free will. Like there's no me. There's no free will. There's just atoms bouncing around or whatever. And then we can like wave a magic wand of quantum physics, and it's so impossible to determine it or have an indeterminacy rule or something. But then, well, that doesn't really answer any questions. It just kind of answers some things and muddies the waters more and makes it more confusing. And then there's the question of what am I perceiving, right? Like the basic question of who am I and what's the world made up of? How am I interacting with the world? What's my power? Because like, how do I, you know, do cause goodness, right? How do I use what is my power? How do I use it to make things better, right? Because that's a fundamental question to everything I do. It has to do with the assumption of making things better, right? Otherwise I just stand there, right? And so these are fundamental foundational frames, and you only have to answer those once, which is nice. You don't have to like re-ask them every time that you have like, you know, you want to, you know, achieve something. But without those fundamental questions answered, you get in this abyss of confusion, right? When you try to think about your invisible mindscape, it just winds up impossible. And so people just grasp onto some magic answer, right? Faith, revelation, like all these just science, like science in the way that people use it as a religion, right? In terms of ultimate answers, right? What is science? It's observing with yourself, right? Your perspective, and then various tools that you like. How do you see better? But that's not what do you see with, right? Like, or when people think, what do they see with? It becomes twisted. Do you see with a microscope? You see with an electron microscope, right? You see with a telescope. But that's a great illustration of how the see with can get twisted, and that's what you don't want to do, right? You don't want to start with yourself, your eyes, and then put something in front of your eye that helps you see better and say, great, that I've answered the question of how do I see with something better, right? What do I see with is looking kind of deeper and more fundamental to what you're seeing with, not like something a lens you put in front of your other lens, right? So a less deep frame, a less deep lens, or a lens you put in front of your eye is the twisted usual, you know, answer to you know, how do I better see how to achieve this, right? And so science basically comes down to that, is to putting something in front of your eye without thinking about your eye, and understanding yourself, in your eye, you know, metaphorically speaking. Right, what do I think with, right? Thinking and seeing, and then boil down to something logically related, you know, things like that. So questions about self, perception, how do I interact with the world? What's the world made up with? What's my power? And then as you answer those, or in conjunction with answering those, you don't have to answer these in succession. Again, you can get bits and pieces. You're not progress, so seeing progress itself becomes a mistake that you realize. Instead of goal achievement and life betterment, right? Goal achievement is just the simplistic kind of answer or the simplistic view of life better. Like life betterment is just by logic exactly what you're fundamentally trying to do, is make your quality of life, quality of existence better. So life betterment, it's no longer about seeing progress. Again, you are trying to understand about thinking and seeing and what you see with. And you might say, well, David, don't you want to make progress about that? Well, I mean, if you're, yeah, here's how you make progress. That's what I wrote up here, is you refuse to say, oh, well, I know that, when you don't. And that can feel like negative progress or pointless until and unless you really fully absorb this paradigm. And then that is progress, right? Again, it's the understanding line. All of this is kind of one total idea that it's just about me explaining better and better. Or me hopefully, explaining better and better, and or you hearing me say it over and over, whatever, and working on it yourself as it kind of fits together. But it's not, you don't need to lock one thing in place and then step on it necessarily. You don't, what you need to do, once you know what to do, you know that by doing it, you're making progress. So that's pretty profound. Once you know what to do, then you know that by doing it, you're making progress. Right? Once you know what to do, seeing progress becomes either irrelevant or automatic, right? Like you see progress by doing the one thing that you do, which it all starts with not rubber stamping stuff that you, something that you feel like you know. And you might say, well, where do you start? You just do your best guess about what might be important, right? So for example, something that's bugging you, or something that you feel like you thought you had right in life, but then it's kicking off signals that you don't. But instead of trying to be in a rush to solve it, in other words, to see the path, but without working on like feeling like it's negative progress, to start questioning what you're seeing with, you use it, because any question, any kind of relevant question that might, about what's good regarding whatever, but whatever topic, if you're seeking what's important about what's good, or right, what can be understood about what's true, good, important about any topic, then it's a thread that leads to the exact same place. So you can start with any thread, right? Whatever's most interesting to you. But what's counterproductive is to be feeling like the sooner you solve the problem that you're talking on the thread with, the more awesome you are, and the better you are, and the better everything is, and the more triumphant you should feel, and the less you see progress than the opposite. Instead, you use it to tug, and you come up with all the exact, everyone that does this is going to come up with the exact same fundamental questions, right? Who am I? How do words work? What do they represent? What is the world made up of? Who's causing it? Why? How do I interact with the world? How do I perceive it? What is it? What's my power? And each and every time you feel like you know something, your mind is giving you that feeling, well, that's right. And it doesn't even tell you, such and such. It just kind of just taking something for granted, but you kind of catch it. Then that creates a space, right? And it can look like a question. And that space automatically will accumulate something good. A good question, right? A question that arises from you no longer rubber stamping your brain's feelings about what's correct, about something potentially good, true, and important, right? You're operating in a lot of darkness, right? Like, I don't mean badness, but I mean where you don't see a lot. But you open up a crack by refusing to rubber stamp something. And again, a space appears, and it's going to kind of be accompanied probably by something like a question. And then something is going to get in there. And it doesn't have to be like, oh, I have the answer to such and such. It's just could be another question, could be whatever. And then, but every time you refuse to rubber stamp, something builds. And that has a ripple effect of creating something for you to see better. The ripple effect might manifest itself as having more interest in hearing me talk, right? It might be just a little bit more interesting, a little bit easier to pay attention because you stop rubber stamping something and therefore right, a space got opened up, right? It's kind of boring to hear me talk about something where you, in your mind, don't have a space with a question for you. It's more interesting. It'll be more, it's easy to kind of pay attention, right? Otherwise, but there could be other contextual factors that you might, like just taking a walk might be easier than if you're just sitting. But good. I think I can wrap up my monologue here. It's been 2 hours. But I'm, yeah, good. And again, what is, so no, you don't see, so can you say, and the good thing is questions are fine to begin with. So let me try to address this though, what Sterling said. If I was to say I see with consciousness, would that be a bit abstract because no consciousness, no seeing? It's perfectly valid. Everything that you're aware of in the moment, of course, is about how I characterize consciousness. It's really very legitimate to say you see, see it when what you're directly conscious of, you're seeing without a lens. And then there are a bunch of conclusions. There's a bunch of lenses involved. We can imagine this with actual lenses. So suppose that you are looking at something through a microscope, and the microscope itself, I believe the way a lot of fairly normal microscopes work is they actually have 2 lenses and they multiply each other, right? So you have the lens of your eye, you have the lens of 2 microscopes, and each of those is relevant to you. Then you can maybe see a paramecium, right? Like a microorganism. But you can't like see like an atom, a molecule itself, but you can, with a normal microscope, you can see the the microorganism. So that direct experience, the direct visual experience that you're conscious of that paramecium, that you experience with no lenses, in a certain way of thinking about it. And in another way of understanding it, lenses play a significant role in why you see that rather than something else, right? If you remove one lens, all of a sudden you see like a water droplet with no distinguishable, right? You're only at like 10x, you see like a 10 times bigger water droplet as if you're looking at it with a magnifying glass, but no paramecium. But when you learn to think of it like in layers, right? Where, okay, I'm directly conscious of the of like seeing a paramecium in the visual experience. I wouldn't be directly conscious of it without the lenses, but I'm still directly conscious of my experience. If the conclusion that other people call it a paramecium is like a conclusion, right? And you can try to test that by asking other people, do you call this a paramecium? Yeah, or scientists, that doesn't prove it absolutely true, but it makes it reasonable for you to suppose that, yeah, you're seeing a paramecium. Then you can ask, well, what would prove it to be true that other people did? Well, then you have to, well, what is a person? What would be the nature of proving it? And you might conclude that you can't really prove it, but you could get to the point where it'd be completely reasonable, and there's no, it's not the sort of thing that you can or need to prove in some metaphysical or or mathematical sense that other people call it a paramecium. That there's an actual paramecium there in the material world is a conclusion. The degree to which that's reasonable, there's various factors, but part of it involves your understanding of what the world is. And so there's aspects of, yeah, there's a real paramecium there that might be correct, and then it's actually a complex idea, saying that is there really a paramecium there in the world? It's actually a complex idea with a bunch of assumptions about what the world's made up of, your worldview, and so forth. Scientific materialism or not, and that sort of thing. And then because it's a complex idea with actually several parts to it and assumptions and so forth, then there's ways that it's correct, there's ways that it might not be. You don't need to answer every question to have a wonderful quality of life and to really maximize your quality of life and to break out of certain mental prison. As a matter of fact, the answers should be fairly simple or extremely simple, right? There's a profound simplicity to what I'm talking about here. It's actually, what's complicated is trying to be happy by chasing down every detail as if you're yourself, trying to be awesome and there's no luck, right? That's what's exhausting and difficult. Trying to match up the environment to what your mind wants, and then your mind keeps adjusting and changing and wanting more or whatever, or taking things for granted, all that. Here's an interesting question, right? Like your relationship with your spouse or your significant other or whatever. You can think, well, what do I see her beauty with, right? Obviously her assumes it's a woman, but obviously illustration I'm making. Then you could have a perspective of if you were 16 and being showed who you get to marry, right? And if that would be really exciting, and awesome, then you can preserve like that perspective and see with it when you want, right? To the degree that you can do that, or whatever. There might be a much more useful perspective. That might be an impoverished one relative to something else you could think of, or relative to your situation, right? Or if you're saying to your wife, oh, you look beautiful, and she's like, well, but what if you don't think that, when you're 80, right? There's all kinds of things you run into when you're married. But if you imagine yourself being, in my case, I'd be 84 when my wife is 80. I can easily imagine being very happy about how she looks, right? Whatever. So, but what you see with is like, as you do this more and more, and a lot of you guys have been doing something like this, plenty, but this webinar can really hone it, make it more distinct for you, ideally, or lead you on a path to making it more distinct, and where you don't drive out of San Francisco with it, where you kind of do it and don't do it, or have your mind twisted. Mike says, I'm just so incredibly rocked by this web. Oh, that's good. I was really rocked by this idea, just, like I really felt like this was incredibly epic. I, at the same time, then felt like, oh crap, I really might not do this justice and might not communicate the epicness very effectively. And Fletch said, I'll get back to what Mike said. Something just flashed me because of Easter. Hell is being stuck like forever as a concept we want to avoid. Yeah, if I had to guess, someone could say, well, Dave, you don't have to guess, but in a sense, there's other ideas out there that are held in people's minds. So this is kind of a good thing as an alternative or as a way of thinking about it. I mean, Jesus kind of referred directly to some sort of hell, but Jesus also referred to, be careful, beware the yeast of the Pharisees. And then the disciples were like, well, so we shouldn't eat their bread. And Jesus was like, no, that's not what I meant, their ideas. Anyway, so sometimes Jesus is somewhat metaphorical or speaks in language that's tangible to the people listening or applicable to their culture, without being outright deceptive or false, of course. But Yeah, like if I were to guess at what the truth is, it's like we're already in the hell that Jesus was referring to, and then there's something God means for us where we're out of it, right? A combination of mentally and if I were to guess, I would think that it also involves us making certain choices and that spreading and a new world of some sort being created. If I were to guess, but I'm not trying to spread that as like a dogma in any way. I'm guessing, and I could be off on that. I could be missing some things, and so, but I just don't want to fall in the trap of like, oh, right here on Earth, you can have everything and it can be perfect, and this or that. Nor do I want to assume that it can't be, So it, kind of don't want to fall into either dogma necessarily. I don't know, and there's kind of problems in various directions. Right. So I just kind of see some dead ends and what might fall in between the dead ends or the wrong ideas. Anyway, Mike says, I'm just so incredibly rocked by this Webby as I basically focus full force on working with David as a tricky way of getting mentored by him for 20 years. Like a way to trick me into mentoring him, by working with me and being an awesome partner and everything and friend. Okay, as if you're 16, could this be a little bit over the top? Could this all be a little bit over the top? Not to dominate the chat, but I can't help it. And if you want to chime in, I guess it's a little bit disconnected, Mike. I'm not making a lot of coherent sense. Maybe you're referring to a bunch of other things you've said as well, and just a little bit of stream of consciousness. But great. But I'm very glad you're rocked by this Webby, and I'm not. So I wanted to see how many draws are on the floor. It happens to be a lot of people live. Yeah, it's good. I've been chatting like crazy by point. Yeah, totally. I appreciate that. It's great to have. Very great to have that. So yeah, and I unfortunately can't kind of both do the chat very well while talking what I've been saying. But let's see. Faith said, once you know what to do, doing it is making progress. Boom. Yes. Where do we start? Right. Exactly. So what to do again has to do with pulling on whatever thread suits you. And instead of trying to see how to move forward, you don't have to try to see how to move forward. You're just by working on what to see with, you're just gonna. It's all most efficient anyway. It's all great. So I've said this in various ways, right? You're nothing of what I'm going to say is really going to interfere with you achieving your goal as efficiently as possible. It's only going to accelerate. But pick whatever thread suits you, and if you truly pull on it by trying to, like I say, like, what do I see this topic with? I've covered the most fundamental frames. I guess I've left out some intermediate frames that I can try to look for. Why don't we really try? I'm always like worried that people won't be so interested in the webinar where we just kind of discuss and practice something that we've already talked about. Like it's more like the big reveals that are more in hearing something for the first time that's more exciting. But then on the other hand, as we get into it, then we want to, complete the job and do it. So why don't we just kind of commit regardless to the next time I do a webinar in 2 weeks, where we really just try to develop this more, with looking at how frames can pile up, what we see with what it can look like specifically with various things. I mean, I've given some examples, but I could develop them more, and show what I mean by you pulling a thread. I feel like I do this kind of philosophically overall, like with how to know what's true and evolution and God and stuff, but then also with like relationships and how they worked and stuff. I think kind of figuring out how to have a good love relationship, I think that was really inherently kind of fascinating to me. And pulling on that thread maybe was something that I particularly did. So kind of, how to see that or like what to see with to understand that kind of from the most fundamental and like the most fundamental ideas of who I am, how the world fundamentally works, what it's made out of, seeking to understand what our power is based in, right? And again, your power, the way I characterize it as best I can is It's really based in if and when you don't rubber stamp something that feels almost certain. You just get but what'll happen is you'll kind of notice some inconsistency somewhere, you know. Maybe something in relationships will just feel so clearly like someone else's fault, and you just say, maybe it isn't. And it really might be, by the way. I'm not saying, like, there can be things in relationships that really just are the other person's fault, right? At least theoretically. I'm not thinking of anything to my wife who might be listening in specific, but they really might be. Or there might be something where you just assume it's your fault, but then you feel strongly it must be something you're doing wrong. But you can actually ask, well, maybe there's nothing I'm doing wrong. Maybe it just literally is fully the other person's fault. That can feel like a scary thing to ask, right? Because you're not supposed to just blame it all on other people, right? Like, in one sense we want to, right, blame things, but in another sense we feel like we shouldn't do that. Whatever, like, or both, like, but questioning things that might feel certain to us is when we're really using our actual power. And most everything else is kind of the automatic processing of our mind, interacting with the environment, processing it based on our ideas and beliefs and associations and so forth. But it's really all done automatically except for that, in a certain sense. So, and then, as I pointed out, that ripple effect. So that's a profound idea. I've said various ways in the past. But all of this is the utter key to success in every way of understanding and defining success, right? And there isn't anything but achieving success in a certain way of understanding it, because there's nothing but trying to make your life better every single action and thought, right? As I said, that you do, the only point to it that there could be to it is to make your life better or keep it from getting worse, at least, right? So there isn't really anything else but success in existence, so to speak, like kind of pursuing it, whatever that might be. Even the success of breaking free from like some sort of mental prison. And the key to it is this thing of like, well, what do I see with? And just building that. And again, I indicated how to build that with the slide, right? The progression of how it goes. This might be kind of a long sentence and abstract, but here it is on the slide. And you just work on it, circle phrases, circle words. And if you have trouble and you're trying to circle words and you don't quite know what to do next, think about what you see with. You're seeing with the way that you assume that words are defined. And then that might cause you to think about well, I thought, did David mention something about stipulating or constructing definitions of words? Well, what's that, right? And what do words refer to? Ask yourself I ask myself, like, is the sidewalk gray? Right? If I close my eyes, is the sidewalk gray? And you don't have to answer the question. You think about how to see better relating to that question. You see, where you get stuck is when you ask a question. See, at some point, constantly, your mind's going to keep reverting back to the wrong paradigm. You're going to ask a question and directly try to solve it and try to see the answer to it. And what you need to do, and it's going to feel certain to do that. And then you got to say, no, I'm just going to try to see with something. I'm going to try to build something to see that I can see with related to what I just asked. Weird at first, and then you keep on not rubber stamping the twisting of doing that back to just trying to directly find the answer. And that's where you keep getting tripped up and wanting to ask me for help. And of course, I don't mind you asking me for help. I just want to help you, right? So when I say it's the answer to your questions, that's a positive statement, not like a negative one, or it's not a negative moral judgment. So this webinar contains like the answer. There's always some way to say it better, and there's some way to have said this way better, right? But one way or the other, it contains the answer. And the answer to all the different questions that you guys have been asking me, or want to ask me, or want to ask yourself, or want to ask somebody else, or whatever. Nice. Is there more you can say about luck? Is there a way to become more lucky? No, you don't become more lucky. what you do is, it's like the way of characterizing law of implication is that you focus on what you can know, and you keep building from there with stuff you can know. And so it's like there's there's gray and there's black and white, and you're not trying to make the gray less gray. What you're trying to do is build stuff in the black and white as much as possible, and then you fish in the gray. But whatever, at some point, metaphor and illustration can kind of collapse. But you're not trying to become more lucky. You're trying to become more prepared with what you can control. But you'll see that better as something that you can see with better gets built, as more perspectives, frames, context, right? Everything I've always been saying, the power is in context, right? The power is in frames, successive frames, a framework building. There's no such thing as smart or not. You could certainly right now be smarter or less smart at certain types of thinking or doing things, but it's all based on a framework being there or not. And then when your fundamental understanding of life has to do with creating conditions for a framework to build, right, to be better able to see regarding a certain topic, right, and certain fundamental questions about identity and the fundamental existence, those apply to like every topic, right? So you just figure that out once and for all. Other things, about relationships, you still use the fundamental frames, and then there's more specific frames. And then the idea of importance, it comes up again and again, but then with relationships, it takes on a poignant thing where it really becomes about whether you have this kind of mutual importance thing going with somebody else regarding a certain aspect of life or multiple aspects of life. Yeah, not trying to answer the question, just using it. Right, exactly. See, a question, as you use your actual power, a space gets created along with essentially a question. The question acts like an attractor. You don't need to double down channeling your willpower to the attractor. That actually kind of backfires, right? Because now you took your power away from where you're supposed to have it, and instead you just keep on. You can just let thoughts flow, but then notice something that doesn't add up or something. I wish I could describe that better. I'm giving examples automatically by accident all the time. But like when I corner someone about extortion, and it's like, it just doesn't add up. You say extortion's wrong, and now you're like saying, well, you love it, right? You want more of it, and and it's like, and then they just want to do something else, right? Or talk about something else, or their mind just keeps squirming around. Maybe so, but instead of accusing, I come up with stuff like that. Why? To figure out what my mind itself might be doing. So the only reason to look at other people doing stuff that's kind of obviously wrong with thinking is to try to then spot it in your mind, right? Not just to kind of rant about them or get more upset about them. Right. So it's like, all right, so when my mind starts doing what I can see other people doing, what I'm trying to get them, right? Then look for something, right? There, that doesn't, I don't really know that. Why am I feeling like I know it? And you don't know something. You don't know something by looking for a feeling. You know something by looking for a perfect proof, where the opposite has to be wrong. Like if the perfect understanding of why something has to be false does not spring immediately to mind, then you don't know it yet. And that's not bad. That doesn't make you weaker. That is you using your power. That opens up a space for something better to go in there. And again, people feel the opposite, right? Your mind with its defense against the defense against you realizing that you aren't all powerful, that you're helpless. But the thing is, if you say, well, wait a second, in a certain way I am helpless, and you embrace that, that's the only way you can discover how you're not. You see? So your mind tries to make you feel certain that in certain ways you're not helpless, right? That you make your own luck, et cetera, et cetera. If you embrace that there's luck, right? Like if you're fishing, if you're actually fishing, there's a way that you can embrace the luck, right? That's why it's a good illustration. I mean, imagine two people are fishing using the same equipment, and one catches a much bigger fish, and they're like, "You see, I told you I was better than you." I mean, that's like funny, right? It's like a joke, right? But you see, but that's how people go through life, right? That's kind of funny, right? And so, but we do that ourselves. We do that to others. Other people do it to us, right? Like on a daily basis, when you kind of look at it that way with it, like with the fishing. So you don't try to get like more lucky. You, now if someone said, "I think this bait works better, and here's why," right? Then certainly if they kept fishing and coming up with better fish based on it, then it would be a reasonable to suppose that they were onto something reasonable, and B, it would be a reason why to investigate and understand rather than come up with a just so story of why it's the case. You know, it's a good like, so someone might have actually come up with a better bait, but then they come up with, usually people come up with like a just so story on like why it's a better bait that really closes off questions rather than asks more questions, right? And so then you could say, well, we don't know that's the whole story of why it's a better bait. You know, maybe let's ask. And then you might come up with an even better bait by asking a question of why that one bait is better, right? Or you might find something about that bait that you can remove or adjust to make it better. Or you might realize it was just BS, right? Who knows, right? But yeah, there's something where the rest becomes kind of obvious and kind of flows downhill when you kind of get in the right paradigm, ask the right question. Cool. Great. Okay, let me just wrap it up here regardless. And we will just, one way or the other, we'll look more into this next webinar. And I'll do my best not to talk about anything new on the webinar, but instead just try to make this even more clear. We'll see, right? I often make false promises at the end of webinars, admittedly, but not on purpose. All right, guys, thanks a ton. Thanks for your enthusiasm. I'm so glad this affected you very much, Mike. And terrific live attendance. I appreciate it on Easter, making it here. And you're very welcome, Marcus. Our slides here. Oh, here. Instead of how do I see the path to what I want, how do I better understand what to see with? And one piece of homework is just to look to catch your mind reverting back, right? When you're trying to ask what to see with, and then feel how it feels so right sometimes to just want to get to the answer, or at least how you'd feel smart. Even if you catch your mind just about like where you know you would feel smart or clever or more awesome if you solve it quicker. And what does solve it even mean? If you perceive yourself to be solving it quicker, you feel that sense of certainty quicker, right? Just catch your mind doing that. And that's a huge progress. You're very welcome, guys. Very welcome, Ruben, Peter, Faith, Gabby, Megan, Julie. Great. Oh, I'm glad. It's fun to read the questions afterward too, right? Or the comments afterwards. I need to rewatch this one. Yeah, I'll try to get the webinar up, the replay today, and also Fletch's. Sorry about the delay on that. So I'll look to get this downloaded and done. So welcome. Great, guys. Epic Easter is now complete. We'll try to have not so epic 2 weeks from now, where we just work on this or whatever thoughts I have. But who knows? Maybe it'll be just pure awesomeness in 2 weeks. Take care, guys.